Life has a way of bringing people into your world who aren't even on your radar. I never imagined my son's friends would have such an impact on me. It all started so innocently. My son would bring his friends over. They'd watch a game, play cards, or just hang out. I saw them as part of our extended family, young men with their whole lives ahead of them, and I often enjoyed seeing them happy and laughing together. But sometimes life isn't as clear-cut. I had been going through my own struggles, a sense of loneliness that crept up more frequently than I wanted to admit. My marriage had lost its spark long ago, and I was feeling like a shadow of my former self. Still, I brushed it off, carrying on with my responsibilities and burying my feelings. Until one day, everything changed. One evening, one of my son's friends, let's call him Alex, stayed behind after everyone had left. He helped me clean up, making small talk in a way that felt unexpectedly personal. He commented on things no one else seemed to notice, like how much I gave of myself to others or how hard I worked. His words struck a chord. I hadn't heard anyone speak to me like that in years. Flattery mixed with guilt and surprise, but I pushed it aside. The following visits, Alex began offering subtle compliments and showing a kind of attention that left me feeling both thrilled and deeply conflicted. He was respectful, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet intensity that seemed to see beyond the surface. As days turned into weeks, these encounters filled a void I hadn't even realized I had. One night, Alex stayed after everyone else had left. It was a night like any other until it wasn't. Our conversation took a serious turn, and before I knew it, I was confiding in him about my struggles, my unhappiness, and the sense of being invisible in my own life. His gaze held steady, his attention unwavering, and in that vulnerable moment, lines blurred. I found myself leaning in, and he didn't pull away. The realization of what I was doing hit like a wave, yet it didn't stop me. It was like being on autopilot. My heart raced, and a whirlwind of emotions took over. Part of me screamed that this was wrong, that I was betraying my family, my son, and even my own values. But in that moment, the part of me that longed to feel seen and wanted drowned out all the warnings. The days that followed were filled with a mixture of exhilaration and dread. Each time I saw Alex, there was a spark that hadn't existed before. We shared glances and whispers, carefully concealing our secret from the world. I convinced myself that it would be a one-time thing, but each encounter only deepened my attachment, making it harder to pull away. I knew I was playing with fire. Every interaction, every smile, felt like a betrayal of the trust I'd spent years building with my family. My son didn't notice the change at first, but as time went on, I felt like he could sense something was off. The guilt gnawed at me, and I began to question every choice that led me to this point. What started as a momentary lapse became a recurring part of my life. It was as if I'd been swept into a current, unable to escape. I started to notice changes in myself, more restless nights, a constant edge of anxiety, and a feeling of being trapped by my own choices. One evening, my son confronted me. He'd noticed my odd behavior and pressed for answers, but I brushed it off, feeling the weight of the lie crushing me from within. It was a wake-up call. I realized I couldn't keep living this way. The web of deception was growing, and it was only a matter of time before everything unraveled. Eventually, the secrecy, the guilt, and the double life took their toll. The situation reached a boiling point. One evening, I sat down with Alex and told him that we couldn't continue. I explained how this relationship was hurting me, tearing apart my integrity, and putting my family at risk. He listened, his face a mix of understanding and hurt. We both knew it was the right thing to do, but that didn't make it any easier. Parting ways felt like tearing out a piece of myself, yet it was necessary. The reality of what I'd done was sinking in, and I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. In the weeks and months that followed, I spent a lot of time reflecting on what led me down this path. I examined the loneliness, the desire for validation, and the blurred boundaries that allowed a moment of weakness to evolve into a full-blown affair. The experience taught me about the importance of boundaries, the dangers of unmet emotional needs, and the consequences of looking for solace in places that threaten everything you hold dear. I took steps to repair my relationships, to find healing, and to rebuild the parts of myself that had become lost. It's a story I carry with me, a reminder of a time when I let my emotions get the better of me. But through reflection, I learned valuable lessons about myself and the complexity of human relationships. I didn't expect my life to feel so hollow. My days were routine, repetitive, like a record on repeat. My marriage had grown cold, and my husband and I drifted, more like roommates than partners. I put my energy into work, keeping our home organized, and spending time with my son. My son often brought friends over, and our house became a gathering place. They were lively, full of energy and laughter, something I hadn't felt in ages. At first, they were just kids to me, but over time, one of his friends, Alex, began to stand out. He was respectful, warm, and had a way of noticing things. It felt good to be noticed, and, maybe, a part of me started to see him not as a child but as someone who saw me. In the beginning, I pushed those feelings down. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks because I was lonely. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more it lingered, like a quiet whisper that wouldn't leave. One evening, everyone left except for Alex. He offered to help me clean up. It seemed innocent enough, just a young man lending a hand. We chatted, and he listened with an intensity that caught me off guard. We talked about my work, my passions, things I hadn't shared in a long time. When he spoke, he held my gaze, and I felt seen. He complimented me, saying things like, "You do so much for everyone. Do they even notice?" It felt like he could see right into my heart, picking out the parts I kept hidden. I tried to laugh it off, but his words lingered, echoing long after he left. I didn't intend for anything to happen, but one night, we found ourselves alone again, and the conversation grew more personal. I shared more about my marriage, the struggles I had with feeling unseen. He listened with a focus I hadn't felt in years. It was as though he understood every unspoken word. Then, there was a pause, an electric silence that hung between us. I knew what was about to happen. Part of me wanted to pull back, but another part, one that craved connection, took over. I leaned in, and he didn't pull away. In that instant, I was a different person, one who had given in to her desires. Afterward, a wave of guilt crashed over me. I knew this was wrong, that I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. But a part of me also felt alive, a feeling I hadn't experienced in years. It was intoxicating, and no matter how much I wanted to deny it, I knew I'd want to feel that way again. Days turned into weeks, and each time Alex visited, it was harder to keep things platonic. We shared stolen glances, whispered exchanges, small touches that sent electricity through my veins. I knew the risks, the stakes, but each moment felt like a bomb to my lonely soul. The guilt was always there, lurking in the background. My son would look at me, and I'd wonder if he suspected anything. I'd catch myself avoiding eye contact, my heart racing whenever he asked about my day. Every laugh with Alex felt like a betrayal, a reminder that I was walking a dangerous line. I convinced myself it wasn't hurting anyone, that it was harmless as long as no one found out. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was deceiving the people I loved. What started as a single, impulsive decision grew into something more. Each time I told myself it would be the last, but each encounter pulled me deeper. Alex filled a void I didn't even realize was so vast, a place in my heart that had been empty for so long. The secrecy, the thrill, it all started to wear on me. I felt like I was living two lives, each one more complicated than the other. My son started to notice. He'd ask why I seemed distracted or distant, but I'd brush it off, pretending everything was normal. But inside, the walls were closing in. One evening, I realized I couldn't keep living this way. My son confronted me, sensing that something was off. His concern cut through me like a knife, and I knew that the choices I'd made could ruin everything. I couldn't keep lying to the people who mattered most. I met with Alex and told him we couldn't go on. The weight of my actions had become too much to bear. I explained how this affair was eating away at me, tearing apart the foundation of trust I'd built with my family. Alex understood, though the look of hurt in his eyes was unmistakable. We both knew this was the end. Walking away from him was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. It was like tearing out a piece of myself, a part I'd grown attached to. But I knew it was the right choice. I had to start rebuilding the life I had broken, even if it meant facing the consequences of my actions. In the months that followed, I wrestled with the aftermath of my choices. I confronted the loneliness that had driven me to seek comfort outside my marriage, the unmet needs that I hadn't dared to address. I began working on my relationship with my son, trying to make amends for the deception, though he would never know the full story. This experience taught me hard lessons about boundaries, about the dangers of seeking validation in places that threatened to destroy everything you hold dear. I realized that the emptiness I had tried to fill could only be healed by facing the pain head-on, not by indulging in temporary fixes. Now, I carry this story as a reminder, a scar from a time when I let my emotions overtake my reason, when I forgot the importance of boundaries. It's a lesson I'll never forget, one that shaped me and reminded me of the consequences of choices made in the shadows. I never imagined things would turn out this way. It all started so innocently. My son, a bright and cheerful young man, loved bringing his friends over. They'd fill the house with laughter and energy, bringing a warmth that had long faded from my own life. My husband and I had drifted apart over the years. We were strangers who shared a bed, each wrapped in our own loneliness, but bound by the routines and responsibilities of life. I watched them all together, my son and his friends, sometimes envious of their youth, their carefree attitudes, the way they laughed as if the world held no troubles for them. I felt invisible in my own life, a shadow in the background. These boys didn't seem to notice me much, and I liked it that way. They were my son's friends, practically family, but there was one friend, Alex, who stood out in a way that was hard to ignore. At first, it was little things, how he offered to help clean up or the way he noticed if I seemed tired. I appreciated it, even if I felt guilty for doing so. But after years of feeling unseen, someone simply noticing me was enough to plant a seed in my mind. It wasn't that I was looking for anything. I told myself it was just nice to have a little attention, a reminder that I was still a person beyond the daily grind. I thought I could control it, that it was harmless. Little did I know, it was just the beginning of something that would consume me. One evening, after everyone else had left, Alex lingered. He offered to help me clean up, his hands moving swiftly as we stacked dishes and wiped down counters. Our conversation started off light, casual, like it always did. But there was something different that night. He was attentive, asking me about my life, my interests, things no one seemed to care about anymore. "You seem like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders," he said, looking at me with a sincerity that caught me off guard. I laughed it off at first, uncomfortable with the sudden intimacy of his words. "It's just life, I suppose," I replied, trying to keep things casual. But the words stuck with me. The way he looked at me made me feel like he saw the parts of me I kept hidden, the parts that were crying out for someone to notice. From that moment on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. I found myself looking forward to the moments when Alex would be around, wondering if he'd say something else that would make me feel alive, seen. It was a dangerous feeling, one I tried to ignore, but each time he offered a warm smile or an offhand compliment, the longing grew. It was a night like any other, or at least it started that way. My son and his friends had come over, filling the house with their usual laughter and chaos. Eventually, everyone drifted out, leaving only Alex and me. He lingered in the kitchen, leaning against the counter as I cleaned up. There was a tension in the air, a kind of electric silence that felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to break it. As I wiped down the last dish, Alex moved closer, so close that I could feel the warmth of his presence. "You don't have to pretend, you know," he said softly, his voice carrying a depth that took me by surprise. "I can see that you're unhappy." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to deny it, to laugh it off, but the words died on my lips. I felt a lump in my throat, emotions I'd buried for so long threatening to break free. "It's complicated," I finally said, my voice barely more than a whisper. He reached out, his hand brushing mine in a gentle, reassuring way. The touch was brief, but it sent a shock through me, an awakening of something I thought had long been dead. In that moment, my carefully constructed walls crumbled, and before I knew it, I was leaning into him, letting myself be vulnerable in a way I hadn't allowed myself to be in years. Our lips met, a soft, hesitant kiss that grew deeper, more intense as the weight of years of loneliness and unmet desires poured into it. A part of me screamed that this was wrong, that I was crossing a line I could never uncross. But another part, one that was tired of feeling invisible, overpowered the voice of reason. For the first time in years, I felt alive, wanted, seen. The days that followed were a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Every time I saw Alex, there was a thrill, a forbidden spark that sent my heart racing. But there was also the guilt, an ever-present weight that grew heavier with each passing day. My son was oblivious, unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. I felt like a fraud, a liar, as I smiled and laughed with him, pretending that everything was normal. I tried to tell myself that it was a one-time thing, a mistake that I could leave behind. But each time Alex and I were alone, the pull was too strong to resist. The stolen glances, the quiet whispers, the small touches that sent shivers down my spine. It was like a drug, something I knew was dangerous but couldn't bring myself to give up. I started to dread the moments when my son would ask me about my day, his innocent questions laced with a suspicion I feared would one day turn into realization. I couldn't keep lying, but I couldn't stop myself, either. The guilt gnawed at me, eating away at my sense of self, yet I was too far gone to turn back. As time went on, the affair deepened, pulling me into a web of secrecy and deceit. What had started as a single moment of weakness had spiraled into something much larger, something that felt impossible to escape. I knew it was only a matter of time before someone noticed, before the delicate balance I'd tried to maintain came crashing down. One evening, my son confronted me, his voice tinged with concern and confusion. "Mom, are you okay? You've been acting different." His words cut through me, a reminder of the betrayal I was committing not just against my husband, but against my son as well. I wanted to tell him the truth, to confess everything and beg for forgiveness, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I brushed him off, plastering a fake smile on my face as I assured him that everything was fine. But inside, I was unraveling. The lies, the guilt, the secrecy, it was all becoming too much to bear. I realized then that I couldn't keep living like this, that something had to give. Closing of a door. I met with Alex, my heart heavy with the knowledge of what I had to do. "We can't keep doing this," I said, my voice barely holding steady. "It's tearing me apart." Continuing the expanded narrative, here's how to carry the story to its conclusion, focusing on the emotional toll and the aftermath. Alex's face softened, a mix of understanding and sadness in his eyes. "I know," he replied, his voice gentle yet tinged with regret. "I never wanted to hurt you or make things harder for you. I couldn't help how I felt." His words hung in the air, carrying a bittersweet finality. I felt the weight of the decision pressing down on me, crushing yet necessary. Saying goodbye to him was like tearing out a piece of myself, but I knew that continuing would only lead to more pain, for both of us. I took a deep breath, trying to find the strength to walk away. "Thank you," I whispered, barely able to meet his gaze, "for making me feel alive again." With that, we parted ways, each of us carrying the scars of what had been and what could never be. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of my life. The silence that once felt oppressive now felt like a haunting reminder of what I'd lost. Every room in the house seemed to echo with memories of Alex, a constant reminder of the choices I'd made and the boundaries I'd crossed. The guilt and shame gnawed at me, making even the simplest tasks feel insurmountable. I spent hours reflecting on the choices that led me down this path, the loneliness that had taken root in my heart, and the desperate need for connection that had driven me to make decisions I would come to regret. I couldn't ignore the fact that I'd betrayed my family's trust, that I'd compromised my own values in search of something I hadn't even realized I was missing. In an effort to find closure, I turned my attention inward, confronting the parts of myself I'd long neglected. I began to ask myself the hard questions. to face the emotional wounds that had festered beneath the surface for years. Why had I let my marriage wither? Why had I allowed myself to feel invisible, unworthy of love and connection? The answers were painful, but they were necessary. I began working on my relationship with my son, making a conscious effort to be more present, more honest. Though he would never know the full extent of my choices, I hoped to rebuild the trust I'd nearly shattered. I reached out to my husband, too, tentatively opening the door to a conversation we'd avoided for far too long. It wasn't easy, and it didn't fix everything overnight, but it was a start. Through the process, I came to understand that redemption isn't about erasing mistakes but about learning from them and finding a way to move forward. I couldn't change what had happened, couldn't undo the choices I'd made, but I could choose to grow from them. I began seeking fulfillment within myself, learning to be comfortable with who I was and finding validation in my own worth rather than in the gaze of others. This experience left scars, but it also taught me invaluable lessons about boundaries, self-worth, and the importance of nurturing relationships. I learned that the emptiness I'd been trying to fill couldn't be resolved by seeking solace in someone else. It was something I had to address within myself. Today, I carry this story as a reminder of the complexity of human relationships, the consequences of choices made in moments of weakness, and the power of forgiveness, both of others and of oneself. I'm still healing, still learning, but each day brings a little more peace, a little more clarity. To fully conclude this story and bring it to a 4,000-word resolution, let's dive into a reflection and healing phase that extends the protagonist's journey, focusing on rebuilding relationships, accepting consequences, and finding closure. In the months that followed, I dedicated myself to the difficult work of healing and rebuilding. There were no shortcuts, no easy fixes. I couldn't erase the choices I had made, but I could choose how I responded to them. I turned to therapy, hoping to unravel the reasons behind my actions and understand how I'd let myself fall into such a dangerous place. Therapy became my safe space, a place where I could speak honestly about the loneliness and the guilt that had haunted me for so long. In those sessions, I confronted the painful truths I had avoided for years. I realized that my marriage had been on autopilot for a long time. My husband and I had let life's responsibilities and the years of routine strip away the closeness we once shared. There were no easy answers, but therapy helped me see that the only way forward was through honesty and vulnerability. Two things I had been avoiding for too long. One of the hardest parts of the journey was facing my husband. Though he didn't know the full story, he knew that something had changed between us. I chose to tell him part of the truth, not about Alex, but about the emptiness and loneliness I had felt, the deep-seated resentment I held for the years of emotional neglect. I explained how I had been feeling, how isolated I'd been, and how our relationship had fallen into a rut we both ignored. He was hurt and angry, but he listened. The conversation was raw, painful, but ultimately necessary. We both had to face the fact that we had let our relationship slip away from us, that we were both responsible for the distance that had grown between us. While we didn't have all the answers, we made a commitment to try to rebuild what we had lost. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight, but slowly, we started reconnecting, rebuilding the foundations of trust and understanding that had been eroded over time. My relationship with my son was another part of the healing process. While he never knew the specifics of my struggles, he sensed that something had changed, that I was making an effort to be more present, more engaged. I became involved in his life again, taking an interest in his hobbies, his friends, and his world in a way I hadn't before. Through these small acts, I worked to rebuild the closeness we once had. It was a humbling experience, one that reminded me of the importance of staying connected to those we love, even in the face of our own struggles. My son became a source of motivation, a reason to keep working toward becoming a better version of myself. I knew I couldn't change the past, but I hoped that through my actions, I could show him that people can grow, that mistakes don't have to define us. In time, the memories of my time with Alex faded into a distant chapter of my life, one that left scars but also valuable lessons. I let go of the longing, the desire, the guilt, replacing them with a deeper understanding of myself and the complexities of human relationships. The affair had forced me to confront my own vulnerabilities and weaknesses, to acknowledge the parts of myself I'd neglected and the areas in my life where I needed to make changes. The closure didn't come from forgetting, but from accepting. Accepting the choices I'd made, the pain I'd caused, and the journey I'd embarked upon to make amends and rebuild. I learned that forgiveness, of myself and of others, is a process, one that takes time and patience. I forgave myself not for the choices I made, but for the pain that had driven me to make them, for the loneliness that had clouded my judgment and led me down a path I never thought I'd walk. With time, life began to feel lighter. I found joy in simple moments, moments that reminded me of the things I had taken for granted. My marriage, though far from perfect, was slowly healing. My husband and I continued working on our relationship, finding new ways to connect and communicate. We became more honest with each other, more willing to share our feelings and fears. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, but it was real, and it was ours. Through this journey, I learned the importance of self-compassion, of recognizing that we are all flawed, all capable of making mistakes. I learned that healing is not about erasing the past, but about accepting it as a part of who we are, using it as a stepping stone toward growth and change. Final reflections. Looking back, I can see how this chapter of my life, painful as it was, shaped me into a stronger, more self-aware person. I came to understand that fulfillment and happiness come from within, that no amount of external validation can fill the void left by unresolved pain and unmet needs. I carry this lesson with me, a reminder of the journey I've taken, the mistakes I've made, and the strength I've found along the way. In the end, this story is one of redemption, of finding a way forward even in the face of guilt and regret. It's a story of learning to love oneself, flaws and all, and of choosing to grow from our mistakes rather than letting them define us. And while the scars remain, they are a testament to the resilience of the human spirit.